They say Billy the Kid was shot dead in 1881. The problem is they couldn't even agree on what he looked like while he was alive. William H. Bonney, Henry McCarty, Henry Antrim. History tells us these were all the same person. A young outlaw, infamous across the New Mexico territory, credited with multiple killings before the age of 22. A fugitive whose death, we're told, marked the end of one of the most violent chapters of the American frontier. That version is neat, official, comfortable, but it rests on an assumption that was never fully proven, that there was only one Billy the Kid. The figure known as Billy the Kid emerges during one of the most chaotic periods in American territorial history. The late 1870s in New Mexico were defined not by law, but by competing versions of it. Political factions controlled towns, private militias enforced loyalty, courts existed, but authority shifted depending on who had power that week. Violence was not an exception, it was a tool. In this environment, names mattered less than reputation, and reputation spread faster than facts. Billy the Kid is said to have arrived in New Mexico as a teenager, drifting through frontier towns, working odd jobs, gambling, stealing, and eventually becoming entangled in what would later be known as the Lincoln County War, a conflict often described as a feud, but which more closely resembled a low-level civil war between rival economic and political interests. The historical narrative places Billy at the center of this violence. He is portrayed as a hired gun, then as an outlaw, then as a symbol of unchecked lawlessness. Newspapers of the time described him as reckless, charming, deadly, and unpredictable. His age fluctuates from article to article. His appearance changes. Sometimes he is described as boyish and thin, other times as hardened and dangerous, yet the name remains the same. Billy the Kid becomes less of a man and more of a label applied to violence that needed an explanation. By the late 1870s, territorial authorities were under pressure. The Lincoln County War had embarrassed officials, exposed corruption, and made it painfully clear that law enforcement was either complicit or ineffective. The public wanted order. Investors wanted stability. Politicians needed a resolution they could point to. A villain helped. Billy the Kid, already infamous in newspapers, fit the role perfectly. He was young enough to seem reckless, foreign enough to seem untrustworthy, and mobile enough to be blamed for crimes across vast distances. But even during his lifetime, descriptions of Billy the Kid rarely aligned. Some witnesses claimed he spoke with a noticeable Irish accent. Others insisted he sounded distinctly American. His height varied by several inches depending on the account. His age shifted by years. Some described him as left-handed. Others swore he was right-handed. These inconsistencies were not treated as red flags. They were ignored. The lack of photographic evidence didn't help. Only one image has ever been widely accepted as depicting Billy the Kid, and even that photograph has been contested repeatedly. Provenance issues, disputed origins, and conflicting ownership claims surround it. For decades, historians have argued over whether it truly shows the man it claims to represent. And yet, the image became definitive. The legend hardened. As Billy's reputation grew, so did the list of crimes attributed to him. Killings in different towns, escapes from custody, shootouts described in detail by people who were not present. Each retelling added clarity to myth, even as the underlying facts grew thinner. Then came the pursuit. Pat Garrett, appointed sheriff and later immortalized as a man who killed Billy the Kid, entered the story at a moment when authorities needed closure. Garrett's pursuit was framed as a necessary act of justice. The outlaw was hunted, cornered, finally confronted. According to the accepted version, Billy the Kid was shot and killed by Garrett in July of 1881. The body was identified quickly, buried quickly. The case was closed. But even at the time, doubts surfaced. Some locals claimed the man killed did not match previous description. Others suggested Billy had allies willing to sacrifice someone else. A few whispered that the body was never publicly verified in any meaningful way. Those doubts were brushed aside. The territory needed peace. The newspapers needed an ending. The authorities needed proof that the chaos had been brought under control. A dead Billy the Kid provided all three. From that moment on, history treated the matter as settled. Billy the Kid was no longer questioned. He was an answer, But answers given too quickly often hide unresolved problems beneath them. The records that survive from this period are fragmented. Many were written years later, influenced by memory, reputation, and political necessity. Court documents mention the name Billy the Kid without consistently tying it to a single, verifiable individual. Witness testimonies conflict without reconciliation. And perhaps most importantly, the story relies heavily on the assumption that identity in the Old West was fixed. Wasn't. Names were fluid. Records were sparse. People disappeared easily. Reinvention was common, especially among those operating outside the law. In such a landscape, the idea that multiple individuals could have operated under the same name is not extraordinary. It is plausible, yet the official narrative does not explore that possibility. Instead, it compresses years of violence, rumor, and contradiction into a single figure. One outlaw, one pursuit, one death, clean, efficient, final. And that is where the story, as it is usually told, ends. But that ending only works if every Billy the Kid described in the record was the same person. And that is something history has never definitively proven. The story of Billy the Kid only holds together as long as one assumption remains unquestioned, that everyone who spoke about him was describing the same person. Once that assumption is examined, the narrative begins to loosen, not dramatically, quietly. The first cracks appear in the descriptions themselves. Witnesses who claim to have met Billy the Kid offered details that rarely aligned. Some described a teenager barely out of childhood. Others insisted he was a hardened adult. His height varied by several inches. His build shifted from thin and fragile to solid and muscular. His demeanor was described as charming in one account and brutally cold in another. These contradictions are usually dismissed as unreliable memory, but the problem is scale. The discrepancies are not minor. They persist across regions, years, and unrelated testimony. In some cases, descriptions contradict each other, even when referring to events only weeks apart. A single individual cannot plausibly change that much, that quickly, yet the name remains consistent. Billy the Kid. That consistency creates the illusion of unity, even when the evidence does not support it. The second issue emerges when the timeline is examined. Crimes attributed to Billy the Kid occur across wide geographic areas, sometimes within time frames that strain credibility. Travel in the late 19th century was slow, unpredictable, and physically demanding. Covering long distances required resources, planning, and time. And yet, Billy is credited with appearing in multiple places with minimal gaps between events. Again, this is often explained away as exaggeration or journalistic error. But those explanations assume the identity itself was fixed. They never consider the possibility that the crimes were real, but the person credited for them was not singular. In a territory defined by poor communication and limited record keeping, names could travel faster than people. A violent act committed by one man could easily be attributed to another if the reputation fit. Billy the Kid became such a reputation. By the height of the Lincoln County War, the name carried weight. It explained violence. It simplified chaos. It gave newspapers a character to follow and authorities a target to pursue. That brings us to the political dimension. New Mexico Territory in the late 1870s was unstable. The Lincoln County War exposed corruption at multiple levels of government. Law enforcement agencies were publicly humiliated. Courts were compromised. Power shifted through intimidation rather than legality. In this environment, restoring order required more than arrest. It required a narrative. A single outlaw, responsible for the violence, allowed officials to reframe the conflict. Instead of systemic failure, the problem could be reduced to one criminal actor. Remove him, and stability would return. Billy the Kid fit that role too well. Young enough to be reckless, foreign enough to be distrusted, elusive enough to explain repeated failure. Once that narrative took hold, evidence no longer needed to be precise. It only needed to be consistent enough to support the conclusion. The pursuit by Pat Garrett is often treated as definitive proof that Billy was a singular figure. But Garrett's account is itself part of the problem. Much of what we know about Billy the Kid comes from Garrett's own writings, produced after the fact, at a time when his reputation and livelihood depended on the story he told. His description solidified Billy's identity even as they erased earlier inconsistencies. Garrett needed a man to have killed, not a possibility, not a rumor, a person, and so the narrative converged. But the moment of death introduces perhaps the most troubling uncertainty. According to the accepted version, Garrett shot Billy the Kid in 1881. The body was identified and buried quickly. There was no extended public viewing, no forensic confirmation, as we would understand today. Identification relied on familiarity and assumption. Some contemporaries expressed doubts immediately. They questioned whether the body truly belonged to Billy. They noted differences in appearance. They suggested that others present may have had reasons to accept the identification without scrutiny. Those doubts did not gain traction. The territory needed closure. A public, unresolved execution would have undermined the very authority Garrett's actions were meant to restore. So the identification stood largely unchallenged, and history moved forward. But that closure created a new problem. If the man killed was not Billy the Kid, then the legend could continue living quietly elsewhere. And if multiple individuals had operated under the name, then killing one of them would not end the phenomenon. It would only end the story. This possibility helps explain something that has long puzzled historians: reports of Billy the Kid's sightings after his supposed death. These accounts are usually dismissed as fantasy or hero worship, but they appear in credible context, described by people with no obvious incentive to fabricate them. The descriptions, once again, do not align perfectly. Different faces, different ages, same name. Rather than disproving the legend, these sightings complicate it. They suggest that the name may have survived independently of any one person. And that brings us back to identity. In the modern world, identity is rigid. Documents define existence. Records anchor people to places and dates. In the Old West, identity was negotiable. People changed names frequently. Records were incomplete or non-existent. Reinvention was not suspicious. It was practical. Against that backdrop, the idea that Billy the Kid could have been a shared identity, intentionally or not, becomes difficult to dismiss. Perhaps there was an original Billy. Perhaps several young men fit the description well enough that the name followed them. Perhaps the authorities, overwhelmed and embarrassed, accepted a simplified truth because it worked. None of these possibilities require a grand conspiracy. They require something far more common: convenience. History often favors a version of events that resolves tension cleanly. One outlaw, one pursuit, one death. But the record left behind by Billy, the Kid, resists that simplicity. It is fractured, contradictory, unstable. And that instability is not noise. It is a signal. Because the real mystery may not be whether Billy the Kid existed. It may be whether he was ever just one person at all. And if he wasn't, then the question of who was killed in 1881 becomes far more uncomfortable. Not because it lacks an answer, but because the answer might not matter anymore. The legend had already done its job. The territory moved on, and history accepted the version that allowed it to close the file. Quietly, by the time Billy the Kid was declared dead, the territory was already moving on. The violence that had once demanded explanation began to fade into background noise. New disputes replaced old ones. New names entered the record. Order, or at least the appearance of it, slowly returned. And that may be the most important detail of all. Because once stability resumed, there was no longer a reason to question what had happened. The official version did its job. It gave the chaos a face. It gave the pursuit an ending. It gave the authorities something to point to and say, this is where it stopped. From that moment forward, the story became fixed. Billy, the Kid, was a single man. He lived fast. He killed. He was hunted. And he died. That structure is clean enough to survive repetition. It fits textbooks. It fits documentary. It fits the way history prefers to remember violence, contained, resolved, and safely behind us. But the cracks never fully disappeared. They were simply ignored. The conflicting descriptions were never reconciled. The timelines were never rebuilt with precision. The possibility of mistaken identity was never explored beyond dismissive footnotes. The posthumous sightings were waved away as fantasy, without being examined as patterns. And the question of whether one name had been carrying the weight of several lives was never asked seriously, not because it was impossible, but because it was inconvenient. A single outlaw makes sense. Multiple Billists do not. They complicate responsibility. They blur guilt. They undermine the idea that killing one man could restore order. They suggest that the violence of the period was not the work of an individual, but the result of a system that needed someone to absorb the blame. That is a harder story to tell. So history chose a simpler one. And in doing so, it transformed Billy the Kid from a person or people into a solution. The man killed in 1881 became less important than what his death represented. Whether he was truly Billy the Kid mattered less than the fact that someone had been eliminated and the story could end. Closure was achieved not through certainty, but through acceptance. Over time, repetition replaced verification. Each retelling reinforced the previous one. Each summary trimmed away uncertainty. Each generation inherited a version that felt increasingly solid. Even as it drifted further from fragmented, record was built on. That is how legends survive. Not by being proven, but by being useful. Today, Billy the Kid exists more clearly in memory than he ever did in life. His name is fixed. His story is taught. His death is dated. But clarity does not equal truth, especially when the truth will require admitting that the historical record is incomplete in ways that cannot be repaired. If there were multiple Billists, then no single ending exists. If the wrong man was killed, then justice was symbolic, not real. If the name itself became a container for violence, then killing the man never addressed cause. None of those possibilities can be confirmed definitively, and that is precisely the problem. Because history often presents uncertainty as absence, when in reality it is evidence of something unresolved. The silence around Billy the Kid's identity is not empty. It is heavy. It suggests decisions made quickly, conclusions accepted without challenge, and a preference for stories that close cleanly over ones that remain open. Billy the Kid may have been one man. He may have been several. Or he may have become something else entirely, a name that outgrew the people who wore it, and survived long after they disappeared into the margins of record-keeping. What we know for certain is this: the story only works if we stop asking questions at the moment it becomes uncomfortable. And once we do that, the legend remains intact, quiet, complete, unexamined. If you found this investigation worth your time, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It helps ensure that stories like this aren't remembered only in their simplest form.